Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and join me as we talk to other knife makers and craftsmen about anything and everything knives. Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and I'm joined by special guest Linda Karst Stone. Linda has been a scrimshander for a long time and has blessed many popular knife makers' works with her artistry. It is a pleasure to have you, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Standard format for the show is, we want to get to know about you personally before we get into your craft. But tell me a little bit about yourself, where you came from, and kind of like what got you introduced into Scrimshaw from that point.
Sure. Well, I was born in Ohio while my dad was going to Ohio State University, so learned all the fight songs up there, and most of my aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents were all in the Toledo area. And when I was growing up there and going to high school, I was always interested in art, always drawing and spending time in the art classes. Had two excellent art teachers there, Julie Harrison and John Nicholson, and they kind of taught a little bit of everything. And they invited a local business that was doing Scrimshaw to give a presentation to the art class. They had to tell us what Scrimshaw was, and they were doing just arts and crafts shows at the time, and they were interested in hiring some kids to do production work. And I went in and showed them my portfolio of little drawings at 15 years old and was hired, and they kind of showed us how to Scrimshaw. They maybe hired 4 or 5 local people. One of them was Sandra Brady, who is also going to my school, and so she and I learned together and worked for them for a few years, and then have both kept doing Scrimshaw for the rest of our lives. So
That's super cool. So when you're going from the medium of like art and pencils and and painting and things like that, right? Like the normal accoutrements for artists to Scrimshaw, was there a deficit that you felt from that, or did you pop pretty naturally into like how exactly you Scrimshaw things?
I think one of the reasons I'm still doing Scrimshaw is because I started so young that I really had not worked up my art talents. I did take classes at the University of Toledo after that, mostly anatomy, some ceramics, printmaking, but the anatomy studies were most valuable. But when I was actually learning to Scrimshaw, I wasn't really good at anything yet. And so I was kind of developing my talents and my Scrimshaw technique at the same time. And I think that artists who come into the craft later in their career are a bit at a disadvantage because they're used to drawing or painting or whatever and knowing how those tools work and how it comes out. And with Scrimshaw, there's a learning curve to how deep to scratch the lines and how close to put them together and the actual technique that you want to use. So I think some artists who are more sophisticated don't stick with Scrimshaw long enough because they don't get past that learning curve.
That makes sense. So probably a good thing to talk about is explaining through your words what Scrimshaw is and some basic techniques, like how does it apply to materials and things like that. Because again, there are lots of listeners who probably know very little about Scrimshaw or even what it is. So can you describe a little bit more about Scrimshaw itself and maybe go into a little bit of the history as well?
I can. So basically, anywhere in the planet where there were ivory on animals, people were decorating it and scratching it up. From early caves with the early man on mammoth ivory, they would scratch little designs in the Egyptian pyramids. People used to decorate ivory, but it became better known when the ships out of New England were whaling, and whales were hunted for a lot of reasons, a lot for their oil, and they went out for a couple years at sea, and so they were scratching up the whalebone and the whale teeth and the baleen from the from the other whales and bringing home decorations things. So it became popular in old whaling ports like New England or Hawaii and different locations like that. But it was a pretty local art and not really well known. But and they would use anything from a pocket needle to just a sailing needle or something, scratch it in, and either fill the lanes with soot from a lamp or squid ink. So it was pretty crude stuff depending on the skill of the whaler, and and it wasn't very well known. And when whaling stopped, it became almost an extinct art. Then when John F. Kennedy got into office as a president in 1961, he was from New England and Massachusetts, and so he collected nautical art and he collected Scrimshaw. And when he was bringing whale's teeth and stuff into the White House, people were informed about it again, said, what's that? What is it? And he collected old Scrimshaw and commissioned some new things. And so that kind of had a resurgence of the Scrimshaw. And when actually Jacqueline Kennedy commissioned a piece that had the presidential seal on it, that when he was killed in 63, it was put into his coffin and buried with him. So, and then after that, there was kind of a resurgence of Scrimshaw, of Renaissance, recreation, whatever you want to call it. There's a company in Bellingham, Washington called Alaskan Silver and Ivory, and there were maybe 20 or 30 artists who kind of took on Scrimshaw and started doing a whole lot more with it than just old ships and whales. They were using color and different subject matters and more realistic. And that's a little how it was 1976 when I learned what Scrimshaw is, and it was part of that resurgence across the United States. So kind of got into it that way.
That's cool. So when you got into it, what kind of materials or learning methods were available at the time?
At that time, ivory was very common. Ivory is not like some things. It's very stable. It doesn't deteriorate. That's why there's still mammoth ivory tusks and things like that around. And here in the United States, there was a lot of ivory. They used to make billiard balls out of ivory. Piano keys were made out of ivory. Mirrors and sets, dominoes, all kinds of things. So there was a lot of old ivory around, and it was not just elephant ivory, but hippo teeth and walrus tusks and fossil ivories. And so I learned to scrimshaw on ivory, which is the best material for scrimshaw.
Yeah. Well, and why is it the best material? I haven't ever scratched anything on ivory, but I've done some on bone work just to see how bad I am at it. And it's pretty tough on bone, in my experience. So like, what's the largest difference in the ivory medium?
Well, each of the ivories is different, but I use a carbide steel till rounded tip point and hand scratch into the ivory. And ivory is porous enough that once you scratch those, the ink can kind of grab into those lines, but it's hard enough that you can polish the surface so the ink only goes into those lines that you scratch. With bone and some other materials, the ink might just randomly go anywhere because it's not as stable as ivory is. So it works best because it doesn't really have a strong grain that's going to pull you like a cow horn or something like that, because those are made with hair and they can be scrimshawed, but they want to pull your scribe along those long lines, powder horns and things like that. But the ivory works best for the techniques I like to use.
I see. So what you're telling me is it's probably not the fact that I'm bad; it's that the material is not that great.
I tell people if they want to learn to scrimshaw, get a thick chunk of ivory and just keep practicing and sand it down and repolish it and sand it down and repolish it until you get something worth keeping, because at first you don't know if it's you or the material. And yes, a lot of materials can be scrimshawed. Antler, the vegetable ivory, the tagua nuts. They're also making many good imitation ivories now that scrimshaw well, even corian countertops. So there's lots of things to scrimshaw, but I think when you're learning, the ivory's better. So
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so I guess probably that brings up a good point about uh, ivory and its current state in across the world, really, because in knife making, we tend to get a little bit weird about ivory use. Mammoth ivory is basically had this rubber stamp of because it's pre-banned and ancient that it's usable, but I still like the common culture around even mammoth ivory is a little bit taboo, similar to newer ivory and whatnot. So, can you talk a little bit more about um, maybe what your experience is with the state of ivory today, the do's and don'ts, CITES, and so on and so forth?
certainly. Well, when I started in '76, there weren't any, but there was an international CITES ban on ivory in 1989. CITES is the Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species, and I'm not exactly sure how many nations are members, but it's over 100, and the United States is one of the members. And so, as a group, CITES had promised that what they were going to do is they were just going to put in place an ivory ban, and then they were going to figure out a way to manage the ivory, make sure the elephants were protected, knowing what countries the ivory came from, and then they would start up a legal trade. They put the ban in place with that intention, but then that was never done. The ban stayed in place, and they never did come up with a way to manage the ivories and make sure, because everyone wants it to be legal. I've made my living with elephants. I love elephants, and but one thing that these laws didn't take into account is how many elephants die of natural causes and that kind of thing. So it didn't work very well. And in fact, in 2016, then so that took care of bringing big chunks of ivory into the United States in 1989. And then in 2016, when President Obama was in office, they enacted a new ivory ban. And what that did is, since it was a federal law, it affected trade within the United States going across state borders. And so, um, and in fact, I was against that. I didn't think it was the right solution. They have some things available now, like DNA testing and things, and they could have made it work, but this was just their choice. They started promoting this by taking about 7 tons of ivory and put it through a rock crusher, things that had been confiscated between '89 and 2016, pieces that had people had brought in that were illegal, or they were wearing a bracelet, bought it in Africa and brought it back and couldn't wear it anymore. So there were stockpiles of this, and they did learn that burning ivory doesn't work. It was too messy, and so they decided to put it through a rock crusher instead. There were 6 tons of ivory in Denver and 1 ton in Times Square, and that was done in the Denver crush was in 2013. The Times Squares was 2015, and that got everybody uproared, and then they got this ban passed in 2016. So it dealt with trade within the United States across state lines, and they were kind of on a roll. So um, there were several states that decided within the state they would pass their own bans, not just across state lines, but that you couldn't sell ivory within the state. And they used bad science and actually lies. They said that they couldn't tell the difference between the ivories, and where U.S. Fish and Wildlife wrote the book on how to tell the difference between ivories. They can tell the difference between mammoth and walrus and hippo and elephant, but there's some states that banned it, banned all sales within the state of all ivories, even the fossilized ivories. So you have to be very careful about what state you live in to make sure you're following the rules. Um,
So, what does that look like for you as an artist in Texas? Like not only what Texas law is, but how does that affect your ability to get pieces from other craftsmen to do scrimshaw work on?
So one of the nice things about what I do is I I very rarely sell my own inventory anymore. Most of my commission work, someone already owns it. They send it to me. I scratch it up and I send it back. So I'm not selling ivory. I'm putting my work on it, but I'm not selling the piece of ivory. So so for me, I can still do those commissions. I just can't sell ivory across state lines. I can within the state of Texas, um, and luckily I'm in a big state, and this is not one of the states that says they can't tell the difference between the ivories. So for me, it wasn't as bad, but some people, in smaller states, it's affected more because they don't have as uh, big of a market to draw from.
Sure. So, um, I maybe a misinterpretation of CITES guidelines or whatever, but what does it look like for possession of ivory, and then what kind of risks are there for knife makers in actually having the material and then putting it on blades? Like, at what point in time does it become art and not specifically regulated by CITES?
For my knowledge, there aren't any states who say you cannot possess ivory. It's the only thing that the laws they have on the book is selling, buying and selling it. So, if you can inherit ivory, even in the states that they've banned all ivories, you can inherit it, but you can't sell it. So, um, if you're if you're doing a lot of sales across state lines, um, it's very difficult. There are a lot of other materials that can be used, but I still hope that they will see the error of their ways and change this law.
Yeah. Well, in hunting, which is where I draw a lot of experience from, because that's actually how I transitioned into knife making. Making my own blades for hunting and whatnot. There's a lot of misinformation and public ire over hunting large game species like elephants, and the extinction of rhinoceros, and walrus hunting and things like that. And obviously, with the way that how to put this, there are certain like indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska and places like that are able to hunt those as part of a cultural practice, right?
Yes.
But even still, those materials are limited to inside of their own tribes, not something that they sell like out to everybody else. But something that interests me a lot in this duality of ivory ban and the knife making craft is the the blatant, um, I guess, misinterpretation of poaching versus natural death versus
Yes.
natural collection methods, right?
Right.
Um, so, I mean, I'd be interested to know what your opinion is on that, because I think that there is a middle ground where that can actually be used as a method for protecting animals and keeping them at least in some way funded to keep these endangered or almost extinct species around. But a perfect example of that is in Africa, and specifically South Africa. I know that there was a rhinoceros rancher who was trying to raise rhinoceros and crossbreed them in order to keep them around. I think it was maybe it was the blue rhino, but I can't remember exactly, white rhino. And there was a lot of political issues with being able to sell that ivory that they cut off of the rhinoceros as part of danger management.
Right.
And because of the culture of apartheid and everything over there, it is a very big racially and politically fueled battle. In addition, with the stigma associated with ivory, but suffice it to say, I believe there's a few documentaries about this guy. I can't remember what his name is, but I'm pretty sure he passed. And a lot of these rhinoceros are they can't afford to feed them and to raise them and to keep them protected against poachers, because that the sea tainers of ivory that they had that they could have sold legally and ethically was basically confiscated, and they had to close up shop. So now all those rhinoceros are kind of back in an endangered state.
That's uh, all the hunting management. We know here in the United States that hunters, I mean, the duck stamps and everything like that, the hunters put their money where their mouth is. And I, I believe that, um, I'm not saying there's not a bad hunter now and then, but in general, they want healthy populations so that they grow big and strong and trophy size. It's in their best interest. We're involved with the Texas Bighorn Society here, and it was just a group of hunters. Texas desert bighorn sheep were almost extinct here in Texas, and they worked with the ranchers and Fish and Wildlife, and now the population's maturing and huntable and it's healthy, and so hunters, I think, can be the answer.
So Linda, let's pivot a little bit on, I guess the getting back into some of your experiences with Scrimshaw. You've been doing it a long time. Are there specific pieces or um, motifs or things like that that you like over others?
Well, I'm a Leo. I love lions. I love doing the big cats. I'm probably known best for my big cat pieces. Um, it's not exactly that they're my favorite thing, but I love them, and I've always had cats as pets, so I understand them, and I like doing the cats. So, but I just, what I really love about Scrimshaw all of these years is working with a customer. If they're going to be investing in Scrimshaw, it has to be something that's pretty special to them, some kind of interest. If it's their pet dog or their um, um, winning racehorse or just a place that they've been. I love that I have the ability to take those important things to the customer and make it come alive and make it last as an heirloom piece that they can have, and hopefully their family will keep as well.
No, I think that's real cool. I mean, I've seen several examples of your big cat or your like safari pieces and whatnot. Are there specific like knife artists that you've worked with where you really feel like you get a lot of room to play with your motifs?
uh, there's some knife makers I've worked with for most of my career. Edmund Davidson for a long time. I think he's had maybe someone else do some work lately, but I've done a lot of his work. I do a lot of work for Lloyd McConnell and Dennis Friedley. There was a maker here who lived in Kerrville, Texas, where I am. His name's Leon Triber. He was a guild member, and he's passed away now, but he was always bringing over knives for me to do, and that was fun because we just hand deliver them back and forth, and so those were always fun projects. Um, so those are some of the, oh boy, didn't make a list of these. I've worked with so many fabulous makers through the years. One of my favorites was Stan Fujisaka in Hawaii, and whenever I did a knife for Stan, it always came with a couple boxes of macadamia nuts that he'd send me to incentivize me to get his knives done. So loved working on those too. So,
Yeah,
um,
fresh macadamia nuts are amazing.
oh, wonderful. so, so he knew the way to his Scrimshander's heart. So, uh, but but I mean, and not just the makers. There's been so many collectors over the years. Just they kind of, I feel like some of them took me to raise. If I wasn't having a good show, they'd come by and order something or buy something, make sure I could pay my bills and stuff. So it's been an amazing career. Amazing. I've loved what I've done. It's been my job my whole life, and I do always encourage other people to give this a try.
Yeah. In the time that I've done knife shows, I don't think I've ever seen any scrimshanders in shows. Uh, Talk to me a little bit about that, because I know that you're a previous guild member and you're an associate member with the guild, correct? I mean,
Correct.
what does that look like from when you started and like when you got into knife shows? And I don't know. I'm interested in that because it's just not something that you see a whole lot anymore. Mostly, I think that niche artistry has been replaced mostly in table count by like the mid tech and tactical industry and whatnot. So you don't really see you don't really see that at all anymore.
Um, you're right. When I was doing shows, uh, a lot of shows. I mean, maybe 20 a year, and always going to the Atlanta Blade Show. In Atlanta, at its heyday, there may have been 5 or 6 of us displaying at one time, and just either people pass on or stop working, or but there just are not very many of us. And the books that have come out, Ava Hollett's book on contemporary scrimshanders, and even as I go through those pages now, a lot of people have passed on or stopped working, and that was kind of a worldwide collection of us. There just are not very many people doing scrimshaw. A lot of people who have the ability will go into engraving because, in general, engravers are paid more than scrimshanders. So if you have the technique, a lot of people will go into that. But I don't know. Maybe it's just Scrimshaw's fate to be a ebbing and flowing art, that it dies and comes back and dies and comes back, and I'm hoping it makes another comeback. But I was just recently up at the Fort Worth the Fort Worth Blade Show, and I didn't have a table, but I was going around, and Alice Carter was there, who does Scrimshaw work, and a guy from Florida named Smitty. He was there. They both had Scrimshaw for sale, um, but out of a show of 400 tables, 2 is not very many. So there's
Yeah,
just not very many of us.
yeah. And do you think, is there any correlation in part at least to the availability of ivory or makers not using materials that are scrimshaw friendly that you think is part of the reason why it's not as popular anymore?
I don't think that that's the reason. I think that there's just not as much out there, and less people know what scrimshaw is if they haven't been doing shows for a long time and haven't seen it on displays. And it's not featured in a lot of the magazines as much anymore. All of the knife illustrated magazines and things like that, they used to have full scrimshaw sections. The knives annual books always had a scrimshaw section, um, and you could find out who was currently working and what they were up to. But scrimshaw is just, I I do think the ivory is a problem because people are not up on the laws and things, and so it's just there's so many other things to do. It's easier to stay away from it than to create a piece that someone might not be able to buy because of where they live. And so I guess that does have a deterrent built into it. But new scrimshanders could be working on different things, or there's other, besides the knife world, people in the old whaling ports, they could still just do ships, or if you loved dogs, you could scrimshaw just dogs.
Yeah.
And so it's just such a specialized art, and it is time consuming, so there's not a lot of it, but I do think it's still a viable trade to go into and learn. I think there will be collectors, so I hope so.
Yeah. Well, and doing some research on your work holistically, I noticed that we probably see Scrimshaw a little bit more than we think, right? I mean, you've done some work in the Hollywood set scene and everything, right? Can you talk?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about like the Lone Ranger and that leg and the Quentin Tarantino knife? I think that those are really fascinating. Like, can you just talk a little bit more about like what was behind that?
Uh, that the Lone Ranger thing was a pretty interesting uh, happening for me. I got a phone call. Someone said they were a set producer for Disney, and they saw my work, and could they FedEx me a sample for me to work on, and could I get it done and FedEx it back? I'm like, well, sure, so send it. So next day arrives a plastic bottle. It was they had this plastic material formed like a bottle, had the curves and things, and they sent me a little drawing, and they asked me to call them when I got there and take pictures, and I did. I did this sample. I sent it back. It was plastic. It didn't scrimshaw well, but it did scrimshaw, and so then they it was produced by Disney, and Disney really knows how to write a contract. It was thick and it was scary, and it was, you will not tell anyone about this, and uh, very very strict about not telling anyone about the project. And so I signed that, and then they mailed me a leg. They shipped it to my house, and they shipped me the artwork. And what had happened was they were already in production, and they thought they could do it all with the computers. They had the artwork, they had the leg. Helena Bonham Carter. A lot of people haven't seen The Lone Ranger, so if you haven't, give it a shot. I mean, it got a bad rap, but of course I liked it, but I wanted to like it. So, but in the production, Helena Bonham Carter, her character Red, has a ivory leg that has Scrimshaw on it that shoots bullets out of her beautiful red boots. And so they actually did a cast of her leg, and they sent it to me in pieces, and I put the artwork on it, and just keeping them informed and sending them pictures the whole time. And but they needed it back right away, and I was almost done, and I said, I'm going to have it finished tonight, but it's going to be probably 9:30, so I can't do anything with it till tomorrow. And they're like, no, tell us what time it'll be done. And so someone knocks on my door from Midnight Express. I had to show my ID and hand over the leg, and they took it and put it on a plane and shipped it out to the set. It was pretty incredible, but it was a fun project. And then when the movie did come out, my husband Mark and I, we got about 40 tickets and invited some friends and family to go with us to the theater and watched it. And every time the leg came on the screen, we were super excited. And at the end of the screen, we were all watching the credits roll, and they were getting smaller and smaller, and then they were divided into two rows, and like, okay, you guys watch that side, we'll watch this side. And the whole movie ended, and it never said anything about the Scrimshaw.
How dare they?
I know. And so I said, and Scrimshaw by, and all my friends said, Linda Karst Stone. But the people in the theater just didn't know what we were doing, so we explained ourselves a little afterwards. But it was fun. And so, but when they decided they need to go old school on it, there just weren't a lot of us to choose from. So they had been on my website. They had seen that I had done one for Richard Petty, and they had seen that I did this one for Quentin Tarantino. And that was another one. It was a gorgeous knife that Harvey Dean did, and he sent it to me, and he said, I'm going to send you this artwork and I need you to put it on the handle. And that's what I do. I'm like, no problem, I can get it. But I got this beautiful knife, and I got this scrolled Inglorious Bastards written out in handwriting. And I called him up. I'm like, why do you want me to put this on your knife? He said, well, I can't tell you, just that's what goes on the knife. I'm like, I just had a hard time, but I put it on there because didn't know anything about the movie yet or anything. And it turned out that it was this handwritten on the script. And that was the handwriting on it. And that's why they wanted it to match. So just strange little jobs.
Yeah. So
Scrimshanders learn weird things.
yeah. So the my understanding is Brad Pitt commissioned it from Harvey Dean, right, to give to
Yes,
Quentin Tarantino, right?
that's correct.
Yeah.
And I didn't get to meet anybody. Of course, I know Harvey. That's the most important person, right? but yeah, it was just Scrimshaw can fill a niche that many things can't, and the way it can be customized for even something like that is pretty fun.
Yeah,
So
you know, it's a beautiful art form, right? And to me, even if you just take it back to maritime type of history, it's still really fascinating because before the era of photographs, you had like archaic depictions, paintings, like Scrimshaw, whatever. Like, however, you could tell that story of what was in your mind's eye or what you experienced. That
yes.
was one of the ways that you did it, and it's like it's ancient, right? And it surprises me sometimes. Like, if I could live multiple lifetimes, Scrimshaw would be one of the things that I would really just love to master. I don't know at my age and other priorities and whatnot if that would ever be the case, unless there is some way to like severely reduce the learning curve. But um have you ever taught any master classes, or like what does your quasi retirement from Scrimshaw look like when it comes to passing the torch or that knowledge?
Well, I have encouraged a lot of people. Whenever anyone wants to know what I do, I really try to go out of my way to help them. I've worked for Shepherd Hills Cutlery in Lebanon, Missouri for uh, over 30 years. Um, maybe 30, maybe 25, but a long time. And they have a show once a year. They sell a lot of case pocket knives, and I do work for them. And they have a class up there that they teach kids. It's a free thing from uh, I think from 4 or 5 years old to 16, and you can um, sign up and take a class. And we've done this annual class for 8 to 10 budding artists who are interested in learning how to scrimshaw, and it's always a lot of fun. It's action packed. And 2 years ago, we had some students not turn up, and one of the employees of Shepherd Hills, actually three of their employees, kind of sat in on my class. And one of the girls who um, did that, she just loved it. She was into it. So for the last couple of years, she's been in touch and getting better. And she just came for a week-long Scrimshaw study down here to Kerrville, Texas, with her husband. And so I'm hoping she might be taking up the mantle for me. So too much pressure, but who knows? But it's not a complicated art form. If whalers on sailing ships can do it, then a lot of people can do it. It just has a factor of staying with it and getting past the learning curve. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, people were built different then too. I mean, it's like I can imagine being on a ship and not knowing what you're going to do to occupy your time for
Right.
weeks on end. It's like, oh man, like I'm getting real bored. I might
Yeah,
have,
years at a time.
yeah, might have undiagnosed ADD. Like maybe I just need to scratch something. Well, I mean, like all these kids in school that will like carve their names and things like that, and expletives in their desks, should really just get into Scrimshaw, because then you could get paid to do the same thing, right?
And I mean, for my lifetime, I've always asked, why don't you do tattoos? And my standard answer is I only work on dead stuff and I don't like the blood. And when whatever town you go into, there's tattoo artists all over the place, and if you have the ability to do a really good tattoo, you really have the ability to do good scrimshaw. So I would recommend, if someone's out there not wanting the blood and the stuff anymore, to give scrimshaw a shot.
So, is there, so like the knife making community has the Knife Makers Guild and a bunch of other like state run guilds, and the ABS obviously is out there for bladesmithing. Is there an organization that encompasses all scrimshanders, or is there any real organization around the craft?
There have been attempts in the past. None of them have really worked because most of us who scrimshaw we're just us at a desk by ourselves, and I guess that's part of our personality. We're not really group joiners and things like that. So there's not. Um, I mean, the scrimshaw collectors. There are several websites where you can look up. There's tons of YouTube videos on scrimshaw that'll show you what to do. Sandy Brady, she has a couple of videos out, and she sells kits and does classes with um, different groups. But we're not really an organized group.
Yeah, that makes sense. So like I know that Blade Show supports a lot of well, artists and people who like have knowledge sets that the industry in knives would be interested in. They do like master classes or demonstrations.
Mm-hmm.
If if Blade ever reached out to you to do one of those or a series of them for their shows as part of that the schedule, would you ever do it?
I would certainly consider it, especially if it was the Texas show and I can get there in a few hours.
Yeah, it's a little bit different than the travel commitment to Atlanta, right?
To Atlanta. Yeah, I did that. I did that a lot of years to Atlanta, but no, I want people to know about scrimshaw and how to do it. So I I wouldn't say no to that probably.
Cool. Well, I don't have any sway really, but
I
it's interesting. If you ever do any master classes or anything like that, that's something that for me, I really love engraving too. But especially coming from a background where I was in pretty deep into jewelry making,
hmm,
but in engraving, as I think about that for my knives, really I just don't have the space and the time. I mean, and also engraving has a financial commitment. Getting all of your setups and your
yes.
microscope and your materials and everything like that, and then also the learning curve of just sharpening gravers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
what I found in like this very primitive research into scrimshaw when I was just trying to scratch some things out is it is actually very obtainable. Like the tools and everything are not the primary focus. It's like how you use those and what you do to the material, which to me is like all it takes is time, a lot of tenacity, and some basic tools, and you really can make some amazing stuff if you just take time, right?
That is exactly true. I mean, I've my area that I work on at home is, probably this little 8 by 8 area of our back porch, and that's enclosed, and I've got windows on two sides, and the materials are just, I mean, if you get into the cutting and polishing and stuff, then you need some shop space, but a scribe and a bottle of ink and a piece of something to work on, and you're set. It's not the tool I use is carbide steel, but there's people who use um, lots of different points. Some people use X-Acto knives. Some people use the GRS hand machine that you can. They have adaptions for Scrimshaw, and especially if you want to do a lot of stippling technique, then that's definitely faster than what I do. So I use mostly line work just because I don't use the machine, but there's you don't have to have that to learn to scrimshaw. You just need, and you don't even need all the colors. You just need some black ink
Yeah.
and a
And it,
sharp point.
yeah, and is it primarily Indian, like black Indian ink that you're using, or are there other types of ink that work as well, or kind of like what does that look like?
The black ink that I use is made for the drafting pens. That's the rapidograph, and so in my mind, it's ground up into finer pigments, and so you're not just putting the medium, whatever that is, in there. You kind of get some of the pigment to go in those little tiny lines, and I think of them as big gouges that you're hollowing out, and you got to get that ink to stick in there. And so the black India ink, and also some of the inks that are used for Japanese watercolors are lush and beautiful blacks. And the color that I use is Winsor Newton artist watercolor pigments. The professional ones have they have permanence ratings, and so that's what I use for my color. And then I'm always putting a layer of Renaissance wax in between the layers, and when I'm finished with the piece, I think I'm capping off those big gouges I'm making. So
Okay. So when you're adding color in order to isolate it, do you use any like resist? Like, are you using Renaissance wax in areas to like guard others areas from getting dyed, or like what's like when you're doing color or things like that? Like, what does that process look like?
well, I always do the black first, completely finish the black, and if I'm going to put color, I kind of over etch the black because I know I'm going to be scratching some of that back out. So I finish the black, I let that dry, I put Renaissance wax on, and then I scratch the area of the next darkest color. And then I scratch that, ink that, let it dry, wipe it off, wax it again, scratch the next color. And depending on the layout or the design, I might be like, say it is a tiger or a lion, and I'm mixing a couple of different colors to blend the fur on the cat or something. So you can work those wet onto the piece, let it dry, and then you can get the blending how you want it. Um, but in general, it's dark to light, one color at a time, and waxing in between.
That's fascinating. So, um, other than working in knives, have you done any? Well, and your Hollywood uh, fame, right? Are there any other pieces or things like that that have been like particularly impactful to you?
Well, it's always fun to be able to work on a whale's tooth for someone, scrimshanders and whale's teeth. So I really enjoy doing the ships and things. There was a Mystic International Scrimshaw competition for quite a few years that I've gone out to, and I got to go to the New Bedford Whaling Museum and walk on the Charles Morgan whaling ship and take some photographs of my own. And so I mean, the nautical aspect is I really enjoy doing some of the ships and that kind of thing because of the history of Scrimshaw. So I do some black and white pieces or just the sepia tones. So um, and billiard balls, just fun putting globes on those and working on old mirrors and fossil walrus pieces that already were an artifact or something. And I did one recently for a collector who's a friend of ours who it was the history of the Iditarod race on a fossil walrus ivory sled runner artifact. That's a lot to say, but
Wow. Yeah.
and so it was and so the research on that, I like researching things and trying to get the history right if you're creating an art piece. Um, so and lately I've been I've been doing less shows. I've because I have been scrimshawing for so long, I've got chunks of ivory that I may have had here for 40 years that I knew what I wanted to put on them and just haven't taken the time to do it. So I'm working on what I call my legacy collection. Uh, we have 2 daughters and 5 grandkids and lots of nieces and nephews. And so I'm trying to build up an inventory of pieces that, if they want one, they can each have one at some time when I don't have them anymore. So
So, are you going to make your legacy collection and then do any like exhibition or anything to show it off?
I hadn't even considered that. I don't know. Right now, they're just accumulating.
Well, get on that, because I mean, if you have a bunch of work to do, it's like something that interests me about that is, um, I one of the reasons why I actually really like shows, like knife shows, is because of the exhibition quality of it. Like, yeah, sure, you want to sell things and pay for the cost of the show and everything, but really just to peacock and strut your stuff and say, hey world, this is like what I'm capable of. And in that same way, like if you have like the capstone to your career, like these things that you want to really show off or flex your skills on, or just to accumulate, man, it would be really cool just to make a show of it. And to I don't know, like, I mean, like, that's interesting to me. Like, I want to see it, and I want to be a part. I want to be a part of it. Like, those are areas where I don't know, maybe it doesn't mean as much to you. You're like, well, where were these people when I was like hitting the hard times and
Oh
needed to
no.
pay bills? But
uh,
but yeah.
it's interesting. I might.
Yeah, well, I mean, something that also is interesting inside of the vein of Scrimshaw is, Texas history is so Texas, right?
Yes.
And I don't know that there's any other state that has as strong as a connection to like their history and the mythos of things. And it's really interesting to see when artists do Texas history and exemplify that in engraving and whatnot, like what the communities that pop up around supporting them. I mean, you could do work like the Alamo and things, like motifs around that, and probably donate. I heard at least that they're rebuilding their museum down there,
They are.
and something to think about. You do some like real cool Alamo, Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie work, and like submit it there, and then you're immortalized inside of museums for all time for all Texans to see.
I could. I'm actually, we're trying to get a history museum, heritage, Heart of the Hills Heritage Center here in Kerrville. For about 6 years, I've been working with them trying to get a museum here, and I'm on the board. And we actually are working with the city of Kerrville to remodel an old house and put it in there. And one of our directors is Dr. Don Frazier at our local Shriner College. He's in charge of the Texas Center and involved in all of that story, and he's working with people at the Alamo also. Um, so could possibly get that done. But yes, the Great Republic of Texas is a subject all to its own.
Yeah, there's not that many high schools and colleges that teach Texas history as a credit system.
Well, here in Kerrville, it's getting underway. They
Yeah.
have they have some amazing videos. So
Yeah, well, if you, I'll try to keep in touch with you. I mean, I know a lot of like buddy Freemasons and whatnot who just love everything about the Alamo and Masonic history inside of Texas and whatnot too. So if I ever see something that you're doing for that, I'll share it in those groups because everybody, especially in the Masonic world, is a big history buffs, and
yes.
like with the history of the Masonic Lodge supporting the Alamo and whatnot too. It's a big deal. So I mean, that's all super cool to me.
Yeah. Well, and that's a lot of the things I've done have been some of the Masonic emblems put on knives and gun grips and things like that, or a policeman's badge or Texas Rangers badge, or uh, that's all. That's always fun to be able to help commemorate someone, because that's important to them. So
Yeah. Well, I hope that I can build some knives. And probably won't be ivory because I just don't know if I could get a hold of it. But I'll build some knives with the nicest material I can have for Scrimshaw, and then I'll try to commission some work for you before you hang up your tools and decide that I'm not worth your time anymore.
well, you definitely know how to get a hold of me, so
For
let's
sure.
make that happen.
Cool. Well, it's just me kicking myself in the butt to get things done. I mean, my problem is that every time I think about engraving and scrimshaw, um, it's not so much that like the cost involved with it, but it really has a lot more to do with like, man, can I make something good enough that I would ask you to put your work on it and it compares to your work? You know, it's like you leave a big wake in the scrimshaw world because I think about like, well, do I do good enough work or can make something that really exhibits your artistry, not just mine. So
Well, I appreciate that, but I think the most important thing about being an artist is, we are all growing, and we're all learning and at different paces and different things. And so when your work and my work come together, it's going to be the right time. So
yeah,
don't worry so much.
yeah, it's a collaboration, right?
Let's say it's not going to be the last piece. Let's say maybe in a few years that you do another piece. How's that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll give you my business when I have it to give you.
All right.
So kind of on that note, one question I like to ask everybody, kind of as a last question in an interview, is when it comes to new makers or new artists, and particularly poignant advice that you could give them, like if there's like one or two things that you think are really important from like everything that you've learned in your craft, what would it be to those craftsmen?
It's hard for us to motivate ourselves, and it's not usually money that does it. It's usually the work itself, and I think that we just have to sit down and do it. There's so many things that people don't want to invest in, and art is not like that. You have to take the time, you have to learn it, you have to love it. You're going to have bad days, and you still have to sit down and work anyway. So I think just self motivation is really difficult, and however you can get that done is, um, if it's listen for me, it's listening to music and just wanting to see that finished thing. So I guess my best advice is just sit down and do it, and on a bad day go for a walk and then sit down and do it again. So I love gardens. I spend a lot of time out in the garden, and then come inside and work.
Yeah, tenacity, I think, is like the
Tenacity,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
and
and
a little bit of masochism, right? Because I mean, like all those long hours, I can't even imagine for you, like sitting there and manually pushing and scratching your work, and how tiring that has to be to like the upper body.
yes, my hands aren't the arthritis in my hands and stuff isn't real nice, but it's I set myself in front of two beautiful windows, and I look out all the time. I don't concentrate on that one depth all the time, and yeah, getting up and stretching. There's got to take care of that.
Well, that's awesome. I really do appreciate that. Well, um, I I have a million questions for you, but I imagine that you have to get back to your real life. But for everybody listening, Linda's old school, the same way as her craft, and so you can find her work everywhere on the internet if you look up her name. But she doesn't have social media, so if you want to get a hold of her for her work, I will be posting up links to your website.
Thank
and
you.
that has contact details. And I strongly encourage you, as listeners, that if you're looking for somebody who does phenomenal work and who is willing to work with you from a budgetary perspective and everything, there's always something that can be done in embellishing your own knives and everything, or other works that Linda can help with. So if she's up to it and will take your commission, then just remember she's semi-retired. She mostly does her own work now. So I mean, she's
Oh,
put in her time. She's made her money that she mostly can from the craft. So if you're going to get in on it, you got to really sweet talk her and maybe have some fresh macadamia nuts to sweeten the deal.
oh, that's funny. Yeah, you're making me sound hard to work with. I'm not hard to work with.
You have things to do, right?
I have things to do, places to go, people
yeah,
to see.
exactly. And at some point in time, you got to take retirement seriously, right?
Sure. Let's not take anything too serious.
No, I agree. Well, yeah. I mean, so get a hold of her, talk to her. I mean, I've talked to her briefly about some work offline and whatnot, and I will be doing more of that. So, Linda, I hope that this interview has been beneficial to you. It's been a humongous geek moment for me because I've followed your work for a long time, and I absolutely love it.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron, and just thanks for getting in touch with me about this. It's been fun. This is my first podcast ever.
How about that? Well, it's been an honor, Linda. You have a good rest of your day, and we'll talk again soon.
All right. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are loved, and God bless.